Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, the 26th of April, 2015. Preparing for the Outsiders. First Moondog will be a separate broadcast.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Thank you, Mr. Cassidy. Time for Outsiders. Today we are joined together by Eva Cox, writer and social commentator, professorial fellow, as it happens, at the University of Technology, Sydney. James Patterson, Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and Tricia Jar, Policy Analyst for the Centre for Independent Studies. A very good morning to you all.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Have you all recovered from your dawn services? That was yesterday, Eva. Stop
That was
laughing.
yesterday. That was definitely yesterday. Yes, I mean it was more recovering from the hailstorms of last night. That was really scary.
Yes. What have you done in Sydney to incur this
the
cosmic
wrath of God. Yes.
Cyclone sits over Sydney for a week in April, but James has nothing to do with global warming.
No, us godly Melburnians have been spared the wrath.
Absolutely. Yes.
We've got a very soothing autumn break going on down in Melbourne. It has, of course, been the Anzac centenary. Tony Abbott speaking in Gallipoli.
They lived with death and dined with disease because that was where their duty lay.
Eva Cox, through this centenary period, what have you learned about Anzac? How has it changed, perhaps, or informed your thinking?
I think it's fairly scary in a funny sort of way, because I have at the back of my mind myself at the age of 8 discovering that people you were trying to sort of hate the people of the First World War. This was as a refugee from Nazis in England, because the Germans were on the other side, and my grandfather fought in the Austrian army in the First World War. And I think we've sort of forgotten that there's a lot of people that fought on the other side. We're being very nice about the Turks. You know, they were sort of noble, things like that. But wars actually are incredibly destructive and incredibly damaging to people on both sides. That people got dragged into that First World War for no real reason, apart from some incredibly fractious cousins and who happened to be the royal families of Europe in many cases. And yet, you know, we're still, even though we're claiming we don't, there's a sense in which we glorify the masculinity, we glorify the war, and we don't talk about peace. We're at war already, just around the corner from Turkey. And somehow or other we sort of ignore that in talking about this as, you know, celebrate the fact that it's 100 years since then, but let's not sort of push it up on the pedestal in a way that makes it seem as though it's all right to go and kill people.
James Patterson, what's your sense after yesterday?
One of the things I find really interesting is the massive resurgence of Anzac Day and the people who flock to it, everyday people, given that it is not something actually taught that much in schools. I know when I was going through high school Australian history that we were taught, you know, really skipped over pretty quickly over World War One. There was a bit more on World War Two, but it was more about, you know, Australia in the 20th century and, you know, Australia's relationship with Indigenous people and those kind of issues. We didn't actually touch much on Gallipoli, so I'm surprised that there is such a strong resonance for something that is not really taught as part of our institutions.
Tricia?
Just from what James said, I wonder if that kind of comes more from trying to forge like a modern Australian identity and looking back for something to hold on to. And I think that might have something to do with the grand decline of Western civilization or something. But the other thing that I've noticed, and that's bothered me for a while, is that when I was a kid, for example, every Remembrance Day, so November 11, I would have a poppy, and there would be people selling poppies, and we would talk about not just, you know, the Australians getting mown down at Gallipoli. We would be talking about the grander, well, not the grander, but sort of the broader view of, you know, what exactly Australia was part of. And I think also all of the other countries and all of the other nations that were involved in that kind of, I guess, that conflict. And one of the things I find troubling is the fact that with more kind of attention, both political and I suppose cultural attention being paid to Gallipoli and Anzac Day, we've kind of forgotten to kind of look at it in a broader way, in the way that Eva was suggesting, in terms of, you know, understanding how exactly the war affected, you know, so many different countries.
It's certainly been an extraordinary moment of reflection, and I think a genuinely fruitful one, the way it stirred the sort of thoughts we've just been hearing there. It's not just been the straightforward jingoism or Woolworths corporatisation.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yes,
But we still have, to some degree, a sort of fairly macho, fairly
Yes.
Anglo, fairly
it's fairly white
sort of
and
traditional white male, and you sort of do wonder how many of the immigrant communities and the various other groups feel the same sense of belonging. I mean, I think Trisha's right. It's an attempt to forge some sort of unity, and I think it came out of 1988 and some of the things there, because before that, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, there was quite a strong sort of anti-Anzac feeling around the whole thing, and the fuss about war and various other things, and the whole sort of peace movements of the 1960s and so on, which actually were against this. And then suddenly by the 80s, it was beginning to revive, and it became almost a sort of mythic thing for the young. And you do wonder how many of them, some of them apparently arrived in Gallipoli thinking it was a victory. And it was reported by quite a few journos that they didn't realise that we'd actually been defeated.
A victory of sorts, of course, Eva. These are outsiders here on Sunday Extra. Eva Cox, James Patterson and Trisha Jar. Now, if you're watching telly or have been in the last few hours, you might have seen this chap's face.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My name is Abu Yusuf. I'm one of the medical team here in Morocco.
Abu Yusuf, he styles himself, he's an Australian doctor. He was trained in South Australia, he's worked in Western Australia, he is still a registered Australian doctor, and he now works for Islamic State. I think that James Patterson is a really interesting turn in this PR campaign by IS. This is not a muscled up person from the northern suburbs of Melbourne. This is a professional looking after little babies.
It's incredibly troubling the degree to which Islamic State has a broader appeal in the West among Muslims. It's very concerning that someone who is educated, who is trained, whose profession is to care for people and to heal them, wants to go and work for an organisation which thinks that if you're homosexual, you should be thrown off a building, and that if you happen to be alive when you land at the bottom, you should be stoned to death.
And yet there are people wounded in that conflict who need care.
Sure, but I still think, you know, an organisation that, you know, subjugates women in such a horrific way, gay people, minorities, you know, as the Prime Minister says, you know, a cult that worships death, why a doctor would want to go and work for them.
Why would that happen, Trisha? Do you have a sense of what might drive Abu Yusuf to IS?
I have no idea, and to be honest, I don't think many people do either. I mean, I think ever since this whole thing started, we saw, teenagers going over and appearing, the ginger jihadi or whatever, I don't remember his name. Ever since this started, I think we've all been kind of scrambling for answers, and I don't think that we necessarily have any. To go back to what James was saying, I think the fact that, I mean, obviously everyone needs doctors. I'm more concerned about the fact that he would feel the need to appear in a propaganda video, which isn't just kind of geared at, I guess, it's not just a kind of professional kind of detached, I'm upholding my Hippocratic oath kind of attitude. It's something else. Like, he's actually going out there and trying to recruit for IS, which is the whole point of a propaganda video. I think from the IS perspective, it's part of, I suppose, trying to really kind of hammer home the idea that, you know, this is a state, we're building a caliphate, and that, you know, obviously caliphate needs doctors, it needs women, it needs, you know, all sorts of people.
They'll have an accountant next.
Yeah, it needs social services, it needs the things that we kind of take for granted in these kinds of, in Australia, for example. And I think that kind of says something about what exactly IS's goals are, which is something that we need to think about.
They're desperate to normalise, aren't they, Eva Cox?
They are, and I think we've got to be careful. I mean, to say that, you know, that people should. I mean, they need doctors. They've got children. He's a paediatrician. He's probably taking care of babies. He's probably in an area where they're not beheading people. There are a lot of other groups, some of which are on the same side of us, who are equally behaving, you know, vilely towards people that they take prisoner and various other things. The whole Middle East things, I'm not in favour, obviously, of anything that IS is doing, but I'm saying that it's, you know, sometimes in the process of demonising them.
Well, another video overnight of Ukrainian fighters on nominally our side nailing a chap to a cross and setting him on fire. I mean,
charming, yes. I mean, in a sense, violence and things of that kind. And I just think sometimes that we allow people to romanticize it by sort of actually demonizing it rather than saying this is a revolting set of ways of running a caliphate. And let's try and sort of have some sort of discussions about how we actually change the viewpoints. You can over-romanticize the evil and at the same time so it almost becomes a good. And I think that sometimes that this is the sort of thing which is attracting people because you create the idea of enemies in the same way that we demonized the Germans. When I was a small child, you demonize the enemy, but it doesn't necessarily actually give you a sense of why there are people there and what they're doing there and what's happening there. And I just think we need to actually understand a lot more about it than we do because, yes, I have no absolutely anti the idea that he should be making a propaganda thing, just as Tricia says. But yes, I think we should also be careful that by demonising him and what he is doing, that we don't therefore demonise a lot of people who might be seeing some possibilities of creating a state that might work for them.
Or James Patterson, that in that demonising, and you mentioned the death cult rhetoric that we, in this country, have been politically using as a shorthand, whether that underestimates the enemy that we're fighting here. They're clearly showing a great sophistication in trying to tap into our psychology. If we simply dismiss them as a pack of idiots, is that putting us at a point of weakness here? Should we take it more seriously?
I think they do a pretty good job of demonising themselves. I don't think there's much that we can add to what they're putting on the record on their own. When you burn people alive and film it and put it on the internet, when you behead Christians kneeling on a beach and film it and celebrate it, there's not much else that rhetoric from an Australian politician can add to that. I think most people get their views of IS from what IS portrays themselves to be, not what we say about IS. Clearly, as Eva says, we need to know more, but I don't accept this moral equivalence that there are other people doing bad things, therefore we shouldn't single out IS. IS is uniquely bad. It is on a scale that doesn't even come close to what is happening elsewhere in the world at the moment. Yes, there will be awful things done in war and in conflict, and I'm sure that there are horrible things being done in Ukraine, but it is just not on the same scale of what is happening at the moment in northern Iraq and Syria.
What's your take, Tricia, on the demonising idea?
I'm probably like somewhere in the middle between Eva and James on this. On the one hand, I think that, for example, we know that one of the reasons why people go to join IS is genuinely to fight against Assad and the brutal regime that he has led for the last couple of years now, as the Syrian civil war has kind of intractably just kind of carried on. And so I think if we just kind of, and it's less about kind of political rhetoric and more about what we actually do. If how we tackle the problem is to dismiss it, as you were saying earlier, Jonathan, as a pack of, death-crazed idiots or whatever, then I do think that we are underestimating what the scale of the problem that we face is. But on the other hand, I also agree with James that I don't think that that our rhetoric kind of really plays a role in kind of shaping public opinion of ISIS. I think what they actually do and what they put out there is what does dictate what we think. And I think that has a much more powerful impact than anything that Tony Abbott or Kevin Andrews or anybody else could say.
A conversation which has cruelly deprived us of the opportunity to talk about Bjorn Lomborg.
Do we have to? I think we should ignore him because, after all, what's he doing apart from getting money which no other academic has ever been able to get?
Oh, no other academic except the Grattan Institute, which got $30 million. The Whitlam Institute, which got $7.5 million.
James has these figures uncannily readily to hand.
And a few right-wing institutes that also get a very large amount of money out of the Menzies Institute gets quite a lot of money.
The Menzies Institute gets exactly the same amount as the Labor Party think tank does.
Exactly.
But you didn't. National Party and the Greens Party.
But they do.
Sadly, I have to wind up on that because we're approaching the upload limit. First Moondog will be a separate broadcast. Ciao.